So I've wrapped up the final NEASC visit of 2025, a beautiful trip to Geneva to visit the Institut de Lancy. Now this was a wonderful trip as usual, with some beautiful sunrises and the crisp air in Germany setting me off on my journey. A journey which was going to have a few more challenges than I would have liked. Now, as many of you will be familiar with, I had a frantic exchange at Frankfurt Airport, having to do a 15-minute journey between terminals in about 5 minutes to catch my flight. A flight which unfortunately my baggage was not fast enough to also catch. So I wasn't in the mood to take many pictures, so I'll show this picture for a little bit longer of Nunana and his beautiful family who looked after me. They even took me to the Trunk or Treat event at the International School of Geneva, so I got to see 2 schools and have some fun with the family. Now, when I say Nunana's family helped me out, I had a fresh set of clothes, I was fully fed, and thankfully me and Nunana are clothes twins. But then the blessings kept rolling in and my luggage arrived the next day. So here I am, much happier, ready to go to the Institut de Lancy. It was a typical NEASC visit. Lots of learning, the opportunity to be with my peers, to see different ways of approaching delivering transformative learning to our learning communities. I was blessed to be with a fantastic team made up of me, Ashley, Courtney, and John, who stepped in last minute to complete the team. Following that great visit, got to do a little bit of sightseeing around Geneva. I saw the Christmas lights go up and had one final meal with Nunana before catching my flight on the last day. I made sure to take a picture of my luggage this time before getting on the flight to Frankfurt. I was already worried about arriving home without my luggage again. But I was blessed. It got better and better since I saw Nunana. So rushed through Frankfurt Airport, and when I made it to my seat on the airplane, I managed to take a picture of my luggage making it onto my flight with me. So all's well that ends well. I made it home safely and had another fantastic NEASC visit. But now I need to rush to get ready because tomorrow I am catching a flight to Boston. I look forward to telling you all about it, and hopefully I will see some of you there at the annual NEASC Leadership Conference. Another visit is done. A lot of learning has happened. Now on to the next adventure.